So first, I'd like to move into disaster-induced displacement, the need to focus on disasters, and a bit about this concept of resiliency. Why do we have this need to focus on natural disasters? I want to situate this in terms of how we think about natural disasters in the context of global environmental change. Specifically, when we think about natural disasters, we're focusing specifically in this module, thinking about climate and weather patterns. So for example, if you take a look at one of the slides, you'll see some of the recent science that informs how we need to think about natural disasters and why it's important to do so. So for example, with global warming, we have increased pressure in the lower atmosphere, which means when we have storms, the storms are more intense and have more power behind them, which then can lead to larger impacts. Two, we also have increased flooding, and coupled with increased flooding, we also have situations where we have increased droughts and increased heat waves. Again, droughts and heat waves are increasing in intensity and in frequency. So your droughts last longer. When you have wildfires, they burn hotter and they burn longer, which means they can destroy larger areas. These are sort of large impact, quick disasters. But in terms of thinking about global environmental change in the context of disaster risk reduction and post-disaster management, there's also a phenomenon that we call slow onset disasters. So for example, since 1901, there has been evidence that sea level rise has increased by 8 inches. Right? So if we're talking about 1901, that's a long period of time. That's why that is a slow onset disaster, because it doesn't happen really quick and really fast. The impacts of sea level rise accumulate across time. The other way to think about slow onset disasters in the context of drought is the ways in which drought impact agricultural systems, which means that crops fail, or for communities that are based on migratory livestock herding, water holes dry up. When agricultural systems fail and pasture lands don't have the pasture that migratory herders need, or water holes dry up, you then have an instance where you have increased population displacement because people have to find new places to pursue those livelihoods. Again, that is an example of a slow onset disaster. So when we think about programming around disasters and disaster risk reduction, think about these quick, fast storms, right? Your hurricanes, your landslides, your floods, your wildfires, but also be attentive to the fact that some of the disasters that we have to deal with in the future are of this slow onset nature. So now that we've talked a little bit about what the causes of disasters are and predictions around disasters, I'd like to move a little bit into the quantification of what the impact of these disasters look like in terms of population displacement. If you look at one of the slides, you'll see that since 2008, the numbers in millions of people who have been displaced by disasters has increased from 36.1 million to over 166 million. Because of this great numbers of displaced persons and the associated losses of assets associated with disasters, it is now another reason to think through how we plan for disasters and how land tenure and property rights programming fit into that. In order to get that discussion going, I would like to show you a video clip that focuses on resilience thinking and the impact of natural disasters. So let's watch that. So now that we've seen this video clip, we have some very important takeaway messages from that. First is this idea that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. In fact, many of these phenomenons, the floods, the soil erosion, the flooding, these can be thought of as natural hazards. But because we don't plan well for them, and because sometimes our political and social and economic systems don't necessarily pay attention to them, hazards become disasters. Then what becomes the role of land tenure and property rights planning to mitigate those disasters? Well, think about some of the words that you just saw in that video clip. Information sharing, coordination, contingency planning, community participation, local knowledge. All of these are key terms in thinking about doing land tenure and property rights work at the local level. So for example, bringing people together in a participatory fashion to, one, review the policies that govern ecosystem management, land management, riparian zone management at local administrative units. And when I say bring people together, I don't just mean bring together the technical people who have scientific knowledge. I'm talking about bringing in all sorts of different stakeholders, the vulnerable people that live in those riparian zones, and other people who use those resources as part of their livelihood, because such people have local knowledge about environmental change that can help us think about the ways in which land use and land management influence policy and then can be taken into consideration to think about how you would plan better in the future. The other important point that came out of this film that it directly relates to disaster risk management and land is shifting from a culture of reaction to a culture of prevention. And part of moving into a culture of prevention is to engage in these community participatory enumeration exercises where stakeholders come together, review policies, talk about land ownership patterns, talk about land use and access plans so that they can plan contingencies for a potential event that might happen in the future, whether it's a disaster or some other disruption to the local community. The last point to come out of that film is the fact that these are choices. And I really want to bring this up because we can choose to pay attention to land tenure and property rights management. We can choose to be proactive, and we can choose to be participatory. So what I hope you'll understand or get a better sense for by the end of this session today is why we might want to make these choices. Because when we look at these examples about post-disaster management, we see that some of these complexities are partially institutional failures because we haven't necessarily made some wise choices in the past. Resilience was a big term that was just in that video clip. Many of you may know that in 2012, USAID came out with a resilience policy, in which case resilience means to help communities to adapt to, recover from, or cope with anticipated and unanticipated negative shocks or stresses. That's part of the quote that comes from the policy document. Part of thinking about resilience is to then think about the ways in which we can work with communities to help them reduce their vulnerability while also simultaneously focusing on inclusive growth and helping people in vulnerable situations, those people in coastal areas, these people who live in riparian zones, people who have land or resource-based livelihoods. What kinds of programming and thinking can we do to help them become better able to cope, adapt to, learn from, and recover from disruptions or disasters that happen where they live? Therefore, for humanitarian assistance programming, if that's something that you're involved in, you might want to think about the ways in which you want to think about doing land inventories and contingency planning with the focus on saving lives, right? Because part of what humanitarian assistance is meant to do is focusing on saving lives, saving livelihoods, and reducing loss of assets. If you're engaged in development assistance, part of this resilience thinking with land tenure and property rights programming is thinking about ways to help communities be more flexible in their livelihood strategies, which might mean the ways in which people use land, or when they use land and under what conditions they use land, right? So thinking about really ideas about land ownership, land access, and land use, by whom, under what conditions, and when. That's part of the thinking that focuses on land tenure, resilience, and then this idea of integration. Many of you would have read the issue brief before today's session, but this idea of coordination that also came up in the film has to do with integration. If we think about local communities or sub-administrative units in places where we work, if we think about them as systems, right? Part of making resilient communities is building resilient systems, these systems of people who work together so that they can adapt or mitigate potential disasters. There's two ways that we might want to think about this in terms of land tenure and property rights programming. One is horizontal integration, and two is vertical integration. So if I start with horizontal integration, this really gets back to what I just spoke a little bit about in terms of participatory community enumeration exercises. Bringing local residents and government officials together horizontally because they all interact in one space. And this horizontal integration is really important because many government institutions or officials in government institutions don't talk to one another. So in any particular district where you might be doing some programming, you have the Forest Department office there, the Agriculture Department office there, somebody from Highways and Transportation, somebody from Wildlife. All of these different institutions might have their sights set on a piece of land, and obviously it can't be, that one piece of land can't be used for 4 objectives, right? So by bringing those institutional actors together to talk about what they envision land use planning to look like, to review the policies that govern current land use planning, and doing that in concert with local communities, build social networks and that social cohesion that's necessary so that communities can respond collectively to disaster. This would also mean, in terms of really concrete actions, finding alternative sites to store assets if a flood is coming, for example. Finding places that people could use for alternative livelihoods if they are displaced from a coast or a riparian zone. But the focus here is horizontally integrating people in one location so that they could respond better, and using land tenure as that focal point around which all of these institutional actors and people coalesce. The other way to think about integration that's important for resilience is thinking about vertical integration. So that's the local government official who has to work up a chain of command, say, to the ministry in the capital. And the ways in which the work that's happening in local areas is reflected in national level policy. Again, creating exercises where people within ministries that are in those hierarchies work together to talk about their plans and reviewing their policies, specifically with an eye on where land fits in their development portfolios and where land fits in terms of their future policy making. And why do these linkages matter? On one slide, you'll see that I have a quote from a recent book by Judith Rodin, who's the president of the Rockefeller Foundation, and has been doing a lot of collaborative work on resilience in urban areas with USAID. And there's this really lovely quote that I like that says, "Resilience building requires some top-down leadership, but it is fundamentally a bottoms-up process." And that's exactly what community enumeration exercises are. They're bottom-up processes, but in order to have those bottom-up processes take place, you need to have some forward-thinking, visionary leadership, donors who actually will fund these kinds of exercises. If you go back and look at that slide later, you'll see that there's a link to look at a recent interview video with her, as well as some references in today's syllabus that focus on the urban resiliency portfolio that USAID has. So just to sum up here, community enumeration is an important exercise that can take place in terms of land tenure and property rights programming. 1, because it builds horizontal linkages. 2, because it really taps into the local knowledge of people who live and experience places day in and day out and across generations. You have a lot of knowledge that could help in building resilience about land and ecosystems that should be recognized and legitimized. And then finally, when these exercises are done and people in local communities understand who uses what land, under what conditions, and when, you start to sketch out a continuum of rights. And when people have rights and responsibilities and relationships with particular pieces of land at particular moments of time, which start to get at this concept of secure enough, which is something that you've probably been exposed to throughout the context of this course. So if we want to think about creating this knowledge base that allows people to have secure enough tenure, community enumeration exercises are one of those activities that could be done to start us off on this process.